أهلا بكم في بودكاست هنا لندن. أنا أيوب الريمي وضيفي هو البروفيسور جيري بروتون، بروفيسور التاريخ الحديث في جامعة كوينز ماري في لندن. سبب استضافتي للبروفيسور هو كتابه This Orient Isle، والذي خصص جزءا منه للحديث عن تاريخ العلاقات المغربية البريطانية في نهاية القرن السادس عشر وبداية القرن السابع عشر. الكتاب يقدم الكثير من التفاصيل المثيرة وربما التي ستعرض لأول مرة عن طبيعة العلاقات المغربية البريطانية، وخصوصا بين الملكة إليزابيث الأولى والسلطان منصور الذهبي، وعن السفراء المغاربة الذين وصلوا إلى بريطانيا والذين أقاموا في العاصمة لندن، وتفاصيل إقامتهم هنا، والكثير من المعطيات التاريخية المهمة والتي تبين أهمية هذه العلاقة وتأثير المغاربة في بريطانيا سواء من حيث الثقافة أو السياسة وكذلك التجارة. كل هذا سيعرضه لنا البروفيسور جيري بروتون في هذا اللقاء، فتفضلوا بالبقاء معنا. مرحبا بروفيسور، وشكرا على تواجدك معنا. لو يمكن أن نبدأ أولا بكيف بدأ التواصل بين المغرب وبريطانيا والملكة والسلطان المنصور الذهبي.
The first exchanges happened just before Queen Elizabeth comes to power in 1559, but in the early 1550s you have English merchants who are starting to trade down the coast of North Africa. They're familiar with trading with Spain and with Portugal, so they're working in Iberia. And then, of course, you've got the markets of North Africa and particularly Morocco. So from the early 1550s, you have mainly loan merchants who are starting to trade using Jewish intermediaries, interestingly, who are working for the Moroccan court. And they're trading very interesting commodities. The English are bringing arms and weapons, and what they want in exchange is sugar. They want Moroccan sugar, and they also want saltpeter, because saltpeter is the basis of making munitions, gunpowder. So this extraordinary trade starts to emerge in the 1550s. English munitions for Moroccan sugar and saltpeter. Kind of extraordinary, really, in terms of an alliance between Christians and Muslims at this time. But then when Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1559, things really begin to take off. Because Elizabeth, as a Protestant in a largely Catholic Europe world, is looking for alliances outside that Christian world. So what she particularly does is look to the Islamic world. And of course, one of the powers that she turns to and thinks of in terms of support around not only trade, but also diplomacy and possibly military aid is the Moroccan kingdom in the 1590s and the 1560s. So from that point, the alliance really starts to develop and take off.
Why the Queen Elizabeth the First? لماذا اختارت الملكة إليزابيث المغرب كحليف؟
Well, one reason is proximity. So she's developing also and looking to an alliance with the Ottomans, but that's, of course, on the eastern Mediterranean side. It's much further away, so there's a simple issue about geography. Morocco is a large, prosperous kingdom. It obviously offers an opportunity to push back against Catholic Spanish and Portuguese opposition to England. So it brings together various different elements. So there's a trading element. So you want to develop your trade networks beyond Europe, because Europe is starting to get cut off from the Tudors because they're Protestants, and most of the ports in Northern Europe are Catholic. So you start to push into different areas for different forms of trade. And actually, if you're sailing out of the English Channel and going south, and if you're not really able to trade with Iberia, the next stop effectively is North Africa. If you're going eastwards from that into the Mediterranean, you've got problems because you're dealing with the Spanish. But again, it also creates a context because there's a possibility of a military and a religious alliance there between Protestants and Muslims against Spanish Catholics.
من كان أول من بعث بالرسائل إلى المغرب? Send letters to Morocco.
It's an interesting one because it seems that Elizabeth starts writing initially because she wants to reach out to formalize an alliance, which is initially about loan traders, merchants from London. But Elizabeth starts to see the possibilities of developing that alliance and making it more formal as a political alliance. So from the 1570s and into the 1580s, that becomes much of a closer alliance where Elizabeth is supporting those merchants who are travelling to the Moroccan ports and on into Fez and Marrakesh, and then starting to reach out to the authorities in Morocco, particularly in Marrakesh, to say we want something of a formal alliance. And that's really cemented in 1585. And 1585 is when the Barbary Company is established. So the Barbary Company is given royal patent, so that means that Elizabeth authorises it. It's set up by two aristocrats, one of whom is Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who's rumoured to be Elizabeth's lover. Certainly they're very, very close. So Elizabeth gives Leicester her blessing to create this company called the Barbary Company. Now this is a huge shift. It's a really big moment because that formalises the fact that there is a royally appointed company which is trading in Barbary, in modern-day Morocco. So Barbary is a term that's used by the English at this point for that North African area, but it's roughly the same as modern-day Morocco. So that is a big deal, and actually all of Europe sees that Elizabeth has now formalised political and commercial alliance with Morocco. So that's a real game changer in this period.
What was the reaction of the Moroccan side? كيف كانت ردة فعل السلطان ومحيطه حول كل الرسائل التي كانت تصله من بريطانيا ومن الملكة إليزابيث شخصيا؟ Things or steps coming from England.
It's an interesting moment because the rise of the Saudi dynasty in this period is, of course, very complicated. There are civil wars throughout the 1570s. There's what the English call the Battle of Al-Khazar, the Al-Kabir in Morocco, which is a conflict between both rival claimants to the Moroccan throne, and also the Portuguese are getting involved. And the Portuguese King Sebastian tries to support one of the rival claimants in this battle. Everybody is killed. It's also known as the Battle of the Three Kings. Al-Mansour triumphs and comes out of that battle in 1578 and really takes over the dynasty. So he is looking to use somebody like Elizabeth as a Christian ruler because he's also trying to play various games. He's also dealing with the Ottomans. The Ottomans are in North Africa, of course, in this period, but the Saudi dynasty is really trying to push back against Ottoman control. So the relationship is complicated. Al-Mansour is also pushing down into what we would call now modern-day Niger, so he's trying to develop and expand into West Africa and, of course, the gold trade there. So he sees Elizabeth as a minor player in European politics, but he's very happy to have that connection. So he writes back, and he's very much playing games with Elizabeth as much as she is with him, because they both need each other. But certainly Al-Mansour is aware that this is a useful ally, because he himself, of course, is also not only dealing with the Ottomans, but he's dealing with Spanish Catholicism. So Elizabeth is useful because they have a common enemy, which is the Catholic Spanish Empire, Philip II.
هل يمكن أن نتحدث عن تفاصيل الرسائل بين الملكة والسلطان؟
What's interesting is that she's writing to Al-Mansour, and she's often pleading with him to say that she needs an alliance. They've established something of a commercial alliance, so they're trading arms for sugar, which interestingly Elizabeth is extremely fond of. Most English school children know the story that Elizabeth had black teeth. Well, she had black teeth because of Moroccan sugar that she consumed. So she's writing to Al-Mansour to try and cement those commercial alliances, but she's also saying, look, if we don't work together, I already have an alliance with the Ottomans, which we know. So from the 1570s, she's established a very close alliance with the Ottoman Sultan. So she's semi-threatening Al-Mansour to say, I can bring the Ottomans in here, and so that's a problem for you. He, of course, is responding again and saying, no, we're very much in support of you. We're very keen on developing an anti-Catholic alliance. And indeed, in the 1580s, he sends an ambassador, Bil Kazim, who comes to London, who starts to forge an anti-Spanish alliance. And they're keen to try and support a Portuguese pretender to the Portuguese throne. So you have Elizabeth writing to Al-Mansour about how they're working with a Moroccan ambassador to try and launch an invasion of Portugal in 1589 to put a Portuguese pretender who will be in the pay of English Protestants and Moroccan Muslims. It's an extraordinary alliance. And the letters that go back and forth between Elizabeth and Al-Mansour and their intermediaries, which is very important, the middlemen, the merchants, who are often really diplomats as well, is very keen on developing this kind of pushback against Spanish control of Iberia. Now, it fails. There's a complete disastrous campaign in 1589, but it is to try and put the Portuguese pretender on the throne. But it is an Anglo-Moroccan military alliance, which is an attempt to land in Lisbon and take over that area and put a Portuguese king on the throne. And this is remarkable because it's a moment of Anglo-Islamic and Anglo-Moroccan relations, which we tend to forget. But that alliance is one which is more important than any Christian alliance that Elizabeth has at this time in the late 16th century.
I have read in your book that the queen when قرأت في كتابك أن الملكة تحدثت عن نقاط مشتركة بين البروتستانتية والإسلام. هل كانت تعني ذلك أم فقط لإغراء السلطان؟
It's a bit of both. I think what's interesting is that she knows something, therefore, of Sunni Muslim belief, different from Shia, and actually the English know because they're in Persia at this time. So they do have some rudimentary understanding about the difference between Sunni and Shia belief within Islam. Elizabeth, I think, sees that Islam, like Christianity, has gone through something of a theological split between Sunni and Shia. There is obviously conflict, say, between Turks and Persians, which represents that split. She knows, therefore, that Al-Mansour is a Sunni Muslim. And she reaches out by saying, we have some common points in our religious belief. Now, I think, yes, it's probably quite strategic, but I think it is interesting that she says, we are people of the book. We only believe in the power of our holy book. We do not believe in the intercession of saints, of priests, as Catholicism does. And Al-Mansour understands that. So I think it's both politics and religion coming together. The religious connection oils the wheels of political alliance. But I think it is fascinating that it tells us something which is not the usual story that we hear, which is Christians utterly, implacably opposed to Islam, and vice versa. It shows that there's an accommodation, that there's a strategic understanding of the connection between the two religions. Elizabeth does it with the Ottomans as well, and there's very much a way in which it says, she's saying, Protestantism is very much a religion of the book. It's about your relationship with your holy book, us with the Bible, you with the Quran. So we have common cause there, and we all believe effectively in one God. She sidesteps certain issues, quite interestingly, because, of course, Protestantism still believes in the idea of a trinity, that the Godhead is split three ways. She's very careful to avoid discussions of that because she knows, I think, that Islam does not believe in that. She's very careful to not go into the issue that Christ is the Son of God. Again, Islam accepts the idea of Christ as a prophet, but obviously not as the Son of God. So I think that Elizabeth is really, really careful to sidestep those issues, but still say, we have common cause, and our theological opposition is to Catholicism. So let's break bread together. So I think it's an interesting moment, and also it suggests much more of a theological understanding between the two religions than we've tended to believe. We've tended to impose our own, European imperial post-war on terror arguments of a clash of civilizations in this period. It's simply not true. Mm-hmm. The letters and the archival exchanges and what's happening with trade and diplomacy and politics in this period tells us a much more complicated story, which is of strategic alliance and accommodation between the two religions. So those letters, I think, and those ways in which religion is talked about also lead on the ground to people who are meeting and accommodating each other's religion. Think about all these factors, all these traders, all these merchants who are in places like Fez and Marrakesh, who are working on the ground with Moroccan artisans and merchants as well, with Jewish merchants and intermediaries working with the court. What's happening there, I think, is what's really fascinating, and that's what Elizabeth and Al-Mansour's encounter has allowed to happen. And that's the bit that fascinates me, people on the ground saying, you believe in your religion and your book, we believe in ours, let's get on.
تحدثتم عن التحالف الاستراتيجي، ولكن لدينا كذلك الإسبان الذين كانوا يطمعون في العرائش. كيف كان السلطان منصور الذهبي يدبر هذه العملية المعقدة بين إسبانيا، البرتغال وكذلك العثمانيين؟
I mean, he's very shrewd because, in a sense, he's sandwiched between two great imperial superpowers. So to the north, he's got Spain, which of course has now united Iberia. So Spain and Portugal under Philip II is all one united kingdom, which, as you're saying, is wanting to push through a sort of another version of a kind of reconquista to push into northern Morocco. He's also got the problem of being a sort of contested client state of the Ottomans to the east. So he's using somebody like Elizabeth as a leverage against both those positions. So there's real tensions there. So in 1589, when there's an attempt to launch the campaign against Portugal, we know that two of his nephews have been kidnapped by Philip II, and Philip is threatening to use them as pretenders to come back into Morocco. So Al-Mansur is playing a very careful game here, which actually, you've got to say, succeeds because he reigns for 25 years nearly. So it's a very clever balancing act that he's using to sort of construct a way in which you've got Catholics and Protestants, and you've even got the Ottomans that are all being balanced off against the fact that he also knows that he's pushing further south into West Africa, and that by the 1590s, because of the success of those campaigns, he's also got a very wealthy kingdom. So a lot of the European courts and merchants are also interested in working with him at that point. So we talk about people like Elizabeth and Philip II, but we forget about Al-Mansur, and we should really include him in the story of very wily, very successful political operators in this very complex global world in the late 16th century.
Do we have in the history the names and the details? هل لدينا معلومات عن رجال أو نساء ساهموا في تعميق العلاقة والتحالف؟
We do. We know the names of some of the Jewish intermediaries and merchants who were doing deals between the English merchants and the Moroccan kingdom, who are running many of the sugar plantations. We know the names of many of the English merchants, people like Hogan and Wyndham, who were writing back and forth to the Jewish intermediaries, to Elizabeth, to Leicester, to people in the Moroccan court. So we have a whole network of actors that we can reconstruct. We have less from the Moroccan side, but I think that's really interesting in terms of how we develop research from this point onwards. I'm really fascinated by the idea of how we can look again, perhaps at archives in Morocco, because we tend to look at archives in London or in America, mainly more in the kind of Anglo-American European context. But actually, I think there's probably much richer material that we could find that tells both sides of the stories. So we tend to, and I would acknowledge that in my work, I've used the English archive, less so with the Moroccan materials. But other scholars are starting to do that. People like Nabil Matar, who's written a wonderful book about Britain and Barbary, and has looked at some of the archives in Fez and in Rabat. And I think that that's a fascinating way of thinking about how you could develop this story, which tells it, as it were, both sides. And that will produce a much richer story, I think, of what's going on in this period.
ماذا عن أول سفير وصل إلى بريطانيا؟ من هو وكيف وصل إلى بريطانيا وكيف كانت حياته في لندن؟
The English records refer to him as Mushak Rais. He's probably called Bil Kazim from his Moroccan context. He is sent as both a trade and a diplomatic figure to develop this Anglo-Moroccan alliance, particularly around what's going on in Portugal. So he's working with people like Leicester and Elizabeth, and probably Elizabeth's spy master, a man called Walsingham, Francis Walsingham, to develop this alliance, to also build a military alliance, which is about trying to disrupt Portuguese-Spanish control in Iberia under Philip II. He's also working, fascinatingly, on perhaps an attempt to disrupt Spanish New World control. So we know at this point that the Spanish are in control of the Atlantic slave trade, and they're also in control of the Caribbean and South American trade, which is bringing in huge amounts of silver into Europe. So Bilkazim is going to London in 1589, and he's working with the highest echelons of the Elizabethan state to talk about both policy in Iberia and North Africa, but also how that might be able to disrupt what the Spanish are doing in the New World, and to think about an alliance that with Moroccan money from the success of what's happening in West Africa and the gold that's coming in from that trade, that you could use the money allied with an English navy to start to disrupt Spanish trade in the New World. I mean, this is kind of extraordinary in terms of what he's trying to do. Now, that embassy flourishes briefly. It fails because the attempt to put the Portuguese pretender on the throne in 1589 fails. There's a lot of recriminations between Elizabeth and Al-Mansur. But again, it's not a religious conflict. It's about a failed political and military alliance. And it's as much because the English navy is just pretty rubbish. But I love the fact that Bilkazim goes back, disguised, I should add, as a Portuguese merchant. And he's very much at the centre of this attempt to reconnect with the Portuguese pretender to put him on the throne in Lisbon. So it's a fascinating moment. It's not the only time. We have stories of other embassies that come from Morocco in the mid-1590s, and indeed at the very end of the century in 1600, but we'll probably come to that.
Yeah. And now we come to the guy. I can see in your book that you are talking very impressively. لاحظت أنكم تتحدثون بإعجاب كبير في كتابكم عن السفير عنون. هل يمكن أن نتحدث عنه، عن شخصيته، كيف وصل، كيف كانت حياته في لندن؟
It's a fascinating story. We know him in the records as Muhammad al-Anuri, which is how I'll refer to him. But there are various different versions of his name. He emerges in the English records in around 1599. There's talk of him that he's from Fez. It's unclear, and as the story begins to unfold, he becomes a much more complex figure. So initially he seems to be set up as Al-Mansur's ambassador who will travel to London in 1600 with the idea that he will cement this developing over several decades, this Anglo-Moroccan alliance, that it is predominantly by this point a military alliance, because it's an attempt again to put together an army and a navy that will invade southern Iberia, push into Portugal and Spain, that will also attempt to land in the New World of the Americas, using an English navy with Al-Mansur's money, probably in the Caribbean somewhere. Extraordinary. So he comes over in 1600. He comes with a retinue of about 16 other Moroccans. One we know is called an interpreter. Another is known as a holy man. So it's clearly a retinue that is there to stay for some time. He arrives in Dover. He's met by the representatives of the Barbary Company, who fund the whole project. He's taken in great state into central London. He's put up in a house on the Strand, right in the dead centre of London, in a palace. And there people see him, and there's various comments about what people make of him, why he's there. We have some people talking about how he works with his entourage. They talk about how he prepares his meat, clearly halal. They talk about the slaying of the animals. They talk about how they pray facing east. They talk about prayer beads. There's some confusion. They talk about the saints that they pray to. All of this is kind of fascinating because it tells me that there's a lot of interest in what's going on in that house. Yes, there are some people who refer to them as barbarians. There are others who say, we are very honoured to have these people in London. Now, clearly, the Barbary Company is paying for his presence. He goes twice to have high-level diplomatic meetings with Elizabeth at two of her palaces. We know that in November 1600, he goes to this incredible event in Whitehall, which is called the Accession Day Tilt. So it's a celebration of Elizabeth's, the anniversary of her first accession to England. He's seen as an honoured guest. Many people see him there with his entourage. He watches the Queen. He sees these tournaments that take place. Various people write about his presence, are debating what he's doing, how he's talking to the Queen. He meets, they talk in Spanish and Italian, which is very interesting, and they develop this idea of a military alliance. Elizabeth gets cold feet, but she gets cold feet because, as ever, she's concerned that the long-standing Anglo-Islamic alliance that she's built is with the Ottomans. So although she's fascinated and really seduced by the idea of this alliance that al-Nuri is proposing on behalf of al-Mansour, she's just quite not sure. There are other issues that are clearly going on, which is fascinating. There are stories that the interpreter and the so-called holy man die, which I find fascinating. So you have two Muslims from Morocco that are buried somewhere in central London, off the Strand. Amazing. There are then stories, has al-Nuri poisoned them? Now, we don't know what's going on, but clearly there's a lot of very murky commercial, political, military, espionage, all kinds of things are going on here. Clearly they're impressed with al-Nuri. He's clearly a very seductive cosmopolitan figure. We know that his portrait is painted, and this is an amazing portrait. We don't know who paints it, but it is dated to 1600. It gives his age, which is 42. It says that he's the royal diplomat from Barbary, from Morocco. And I think that that portrait was painted in anticipation of a formal signing off on this Anglo-Moroccan alliance. Now, it doesn't happen. It falls apart. But that portrait, I think, is absolutely fascinating. He wears a turban. Some scholars have debated that the style of the turban suggests that he is from Fez. What I find fascinating, and various scholars have talked about this, I think that possibly he's a Morisco. I think that he's a Spanish Muslim, forcibly converted to Christianity, which is part of the longer story about what happens in Spain and Portugal in the 16th century. So I don't think he's actually Moroccan. I think he's Muslim, but I think he's chosen by al-Mansour because he's a cosmopolitan figure who has experienced culture in the Christian world. He obviously speaks Spanish. He probably speaks a bit of Italian as well, obviously Arabic. And really Spanish and Italian are sort of the lingua franca at this time if you're going to have these kind of discussions and debates between Moroccans and the English. So I think he's probably a Spanish Muslim or a Morisco who has been forcibly converted. And then I think he's travelled at some point to Morocco and he has reverted. Therefore, he's chosen as a very cosmopolitan figure who crosses cultures and languages, perfect kind of ambassador to send to London in 1600. So the alliance doesn't come off, it sort of unravels. All we know is that probably by the summer of 1601, he leaves. 2 years later, both Elizabeth and al-Mansour die. So it brings to an end just because of those events, not because of anything else, because of a huge conflict around religion or politics. That moment just collapses, rather as it would today if two close rulers, if Biden and Putin suddenly died, the whole tenor of that relationship would shift. And because Elizabeth and al-Mansour die, so for a certain period does that Anglo-Moroccan possibility of an alliance.
There are some information that هناك معلومات تقول بأن الملكة حاولت تجنيد السفير النوري. هل هذا صحيح وكيف كان ذلك؟
It does seem that in the accounts from the surviving archival records that Elizabeth and her advisors are working with al-Nuri in these two meetings that they have, and they seem to realize that he is a Morisco. So they seem to think that effectively he's somebody who can switch sides very easily between Christianity and Islam. And they seem to be proposing to ask him to, in effect, work for their side. So this is extraordinary. So it seems to collide with a more official account of what al-Nuri is doing. What seems to happen is al-Nuri turns down the offer of working with Elizabeth effectively as a Morisco, and remains loyal to al-Mansour, it would seem. It's very, very unclear, but I think this is so fascinating about what it's telling us about the complex nature of who al-Nuri is, where his alliances lie, what his religious beliefs are, what his political support for is. So I think that that's so fascinating, and it tells us that the ideals about religion and belief in this period are so complicated because people are switching so many sides all the time. So we have Muslims who are converting to Christianity, actually very, very few. We have a lot of Christians converting to Islam in this period, both Protestants and Catholics. We have Jews converting to Christianity as well, to Protestantism and to Islam. There's a lot of conversion going on, which I think is really at the heart of so many of these exchanges. It's not hard and fast. People's theological beliefs shift, they change. It's ambiguous, it's unclear. And al-Nuri sits, I think, right at the heart of that. But ultimately, I think he remains loyal to al-Mansour. He goes back to Morocco in 1600, and then certainly from the Elizabethan records, he disappears. Now, whether he does, and it would be fascinating to know if we could find anything out about him further in the Moroccan records, but that would be another story.
Yeah. How were the people here in London? كيف كان سكان لندن ينظرون إلى هؤلاء الغرباء وخصوصا السفير النوري؟ كيف كانوا ينظرون إلى أدائه للصلاة؟ وأعتقد أنه حتى تم بناء مسجد. كيف كانوا ينظرون لكل هذا؟ How they see all this things?
I think the response is mixed. I think Londoners have always had a complex relationship with what we might call outsiders, what they would call strangers or aliens. So yes, I think there's some aspects of fear and xenophobia, the sense of somebody who is different. They look different, and there's a fascination with what al-Nuri wears, how he's praying, how he's slaughtering his meat. But at the same time, I think there's an awareness of an admiration. This is a very sophisticated culture. There's an awareness that it's wealthy. It's a place that you want to trade with. There's confusion around what Islam represents. So yes, there's a sense of perhaps it's something which is antagonistic to Christianity. Maybe it's not, though. Maybe our new Reformed Protestant belief could find a way of working with Islam. And this is undoubtedly a period where most Elizabethans would really have understood that the great superpower in this period is an Islamic one. It's the Ottoman Empire. And that the Barbary states are also very powerful. And that England is a small player in this world. So I think we need to be really careful about assuming that it's just a total lack of interest in Moroccan Islamic traditions, and also that it's antagonistic. I think that there's more known about Islam in this period, and it's partly from the Moroccan trade, and that there's much more of what I'd call an ambivalence. Maybe actually you can work with such people. Maybe it's good for the country and certainly for London to have these kind of alliances. So we have fragments of that where people are clearly admiring of it. And also we have a lot of merchants who are clearly putting aside any issues about theology because they want to work and trade with people. They want to enrich themselves. And money, I think, in this period often trumps religion, as we know it does across history.
نتحدث عن قصة مهمة وهي العلاقة بين شكسبير والسفير النوري. هل فعلا التقيا؟ وهل استلهم شكسبير مسرحياته من السفير أو من السلطان؟
So Shakespeare's Othello is usually a play which we see as about a tragedy of a black man, Othello, the Moor of Venice. And he's played usually as a black man, as an African man. I have problems with this. I agree that it's a fascinating story and that we shouldn't disregard the questions of race in the play. But I think it's fascinating that he is a Moor, so Moor for Elizabethan audience would have been known as somebody from North Africa, probably Muslim. So actually we have to think of him as a Barbary Moor, as somebody from Morocco. He talks in the play about his conversion. We must assume that that's a conversion from Islam to Christianity, but therefore, rather like al-Nuri, maybe he's somebody who could reconvert to Islam. So I think that there's much more of an issue about his religious identity as a former Muslim as the colour of his skin. Now, the fact that Shakespeare writes this play, we know that it's performed in 1603. Most scholars argue that he's probably working on it from around 1601, 1602. Al-Nuri is a very, very visible, high-level diplomat who's living on the Strand, moving around London, seen by a lot of Londoners for 6 months, and then he leaves, and almost as soon as he leaves, Shakespeare starts working on Othello. I don't think there can be a coincidence. I'm not suggesting that Al-Nuri is the direct model for Othello, but I am saying that Shakespeare's been aware that for the previous 30, 40 years, there's been an intensive Anglo-Moroccan alliance which has brought Moroccans, Moors, like Al-Anouri, into London. They are part of the fabric of the city. And I think he's aware that that fascinates his audience. Again, it's back to this question of ambivalence. Are these people we trust? Are they not? Are they people we can do business with? Should we be in alliance with them? Should we not? That is such a fascinating story. I think Shakespeare thinks that is such a fascinating story, and I think Shakespeare picks up on that source material, this long tradition of an Anglo-Moroccan alliance, and the appearance of somebody as fascinating, exotic, powerful, commanding as Al-Anouri. Did they meet? I think it's hard to say. I think it's very possible that Shakespeare would have been aware of the chatter of Al-Anouri. Did he go to the London theatres? I love to speculate on the idea that he's a high-level diplomatic guest. What's the kind of thing that you'd do? You'd encourage somebody to go to what's so vital to London and what defines London in this period more than anything else, the commercial theatres. So I'm quite convinced that Shakespeare is drawing on this long tradition of Anglo-Islamic relations. He's doing plays throughout his career. Titus Andronicus is a play from the early 1590s. It has a Moor called Aaron. Well, that coincides with the first Moroccan ambassador arriving in London. In 1595, he writes The Merchant of Venice. There is the Prince of Morocco is one of the suitors in that play. We know that in the mid-1590s, there is another partially documented Moroccan embassy that comes. We don't know enough about it. And then again in 1601, 1602, there's the third very high-level ambassador, Al-Anouri, who arrives. And what do you know? Shakespeare again writes a Moor play, but then puts the Moor right at the heart of his play. This cannot be a coincidence for me. So I think what's fascinating is that Othello is the culmination of Elizabethan drama and Shakespeare's interest in these Moorish figures. And I think the fact Al-Anouri has been there for so long, and then you get a play like Othello, which is touching on so many issues that Al-Anouri is talking about. In the play, Othello ends up talking about the fact he's travelled all the way from Barbary, from Morocco, to Venice, but he's also been in Aleppo. He tells stories about Aleppo. Al-Anouri, in the records, we are told, is about to leave London to go on to Aleppo. Now, it seems, these things are just surely no coincidence. And I think Shakespeare is very aware of that alliance, of figures like Al-Anouri, and that's what he's putting into a play like Othello. Nor is it to just demonize this figure, nor is it just a sort of racist play, because he's a very noble figure. He is indeed killed he kills himself, but his death is brought about by a jealous Venetian soldier, another Christian. So there's a sense in which he's a powerful figure that the audience is asked to sympathize with as much as be appalled by, because he's murdered his wife. So there's an ambiguity there, which I think reflects the ambiguity that has defined English relations with Morocco for the previous 40 years.
You have talked about that. قلت بأن السلطان كان يريد الذهاب إلى العالم الجديد لجلب الذهب. هل كان هذا هدفا واقعيا، وهل كان المغرب قويا لهذه الدرجة؟
In this period, we see a lot of proposals, as we do today. We think of things that may happen politically, or proposals that powerful leaders make, and it doesn't come off. That doesn't mean that they're not true. It doesn't mean that they're not real. I think Al-Mansur and Elizabeth have a very realistic possibility of saying the English have a significant navy. Al-Mansur has watched the English fleet defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. This is a massive shift in Anglo-Moroccan relations, because he thinks, I have gold from West Africa, they have a significant navy, they have defeated my main enemy, the Spanish, let us make an alliance. Let's also consider the fact that I have a certain amount of gold which is flowing in from the West African trans-Saharan trade routes, and he's watching the Spanish bring back an even greater volume of silver, which is flooding the European markets and is driving so much conspicuous consumption. There's a sort of massive boom in the European economy. So why not? Morocco faces outwards into the Atlantic, so does England. Therefore, it makes absolute sense. They're watching English pirates, which we call privateers, people like Drake and Hawkins, these famous English naval figures who were all raiding the Spanish fleets coming back and forth from the New World of the Americas. So if you can turbocharge that navy and give them more money, which is what al-Mansour is proposing, then why not? I think it is a fascinating moment of a proposal of Anglo-Moroccan naval and commercial power that will attempt to take over Spanish colonies in the New World. I mean, the English are raiding them, so why not? I mean, no, it doesn't happen, but that doesn't mean that at that moment in 1589, 1590, when that correspondence is very, very extensive, that it's not being really planned for and carefully thought about, and it continues to do so for over a decade.
My last question. تحدثت عن الإمبراطورية المغربية. هل يمكن القول بأن المغرب كان إمبراطورية في تلك الفترة؟ Big empire?
I mean, I think that there is, if you're living in Iberia and North Africa, yes, you consider that the Sa'dian dynasty is a big player in the region. And again, we forget about that. We often talk about the Mediterranean, but one scholar talks about this as a forgotten empire. This region, was the real center of what was happening, I think globally to some extent, what was happening on the North African coast and in the Eastern Mediterranean, that clash between Catholic Christianity and Ottoman Sunni Muslim power, and in the middle of which you had another very significant power, which is the Sa'dian dynasty. Like England, I think it's an emerging power. It's trying to establish its imperial authority in the region. So is it a global superpower? No. But is it very important in that region? Absolutely. Are all the key players globally looking at what's happening in Morocco, like Philip II, Elizabeth I? Yes, they are. So I think that we need to put it back into that global geopolitics of the late 16th century. It is very important. Africa is so often forgotten in both this period and subsequent periods. And the Sa'dian dynasty and what's happening in Morocco is really, it's a sort of pivot between what's happening in southern Europe and also what's happening in West Africa and that trans-Saharan gold route, which is still really important. If you're a merchant in 1590, you want to know what's happening there. Fez and Marrakesh are really at the heart of your imagined commercial imperial world picture. So yeah, I think that it is very important in this period.
Thank you very much, Professor, for being us and for... شكرا جزيلا بروفيسور على تواجدك معنا. Thank you very much.